And now I will call Sarah Gibb from Victoria Junior College.
The financial downturn that we are facing today started off as a crisis in America on Wall Street. It has moved beyond that to wreak havoc on Main Street. It's affecting you and it's affecting me. So clearly the issue today is not just about banks failing, but it's about weak economic sentiment. So how do we best revive the Singapore economy? Through two measures. First of all, ensuring that there is sufficient liquidity in the market, and secondly, by stimulating demand in the real economy. Now, the Ministry of Finance's policy is limited because it aims to stimulate demand through fiscal measures. But by not saving banks, what it does is that it doesn't deal with the issue of liquidity. Now, with banks, this is foolhardy because banks ensure the smooth flow of liquidity in the market. Now, businesses borrow from banks to finance operations, and investments are also made through banks. So when banks fail, their fiscal policy is not going to achieve their aim of pumping capital into the economy through stimulating demand. Because when banks fail, people take their money out of banks, they take it out of the system, and they're afraid to spend. So I'm going to elaborate on the exact tenets of their policy later. Now, on the other hand, though the opposition leader's policy does deal with the issue of liquidity, we believe that it is insufficient. And why? Because he didn't mention exactly what conditions would be given. Banks may still hoard their assets even when they are given a bailout. So to counter this, we will propose that credit guidelines will be reviewed by third-party auditors to make sure that the banks stick to the conditions that have been given to them by the government. Now, secondly, it's insufficient also because it covers only one half of the story. Above and beyond liquidity, it is also important to stimulate demand because if we don't, banks may be willing to lend, but they are unable to because people are not confident enough to borrow and to spend. So the stimulation of demand can be done in two ways: consumer spending, government spending. Now, our policy will ensure consumer spending through measures like giving taxpayers GST credits of 40%, giving local retailers extended property rebates, and government spending will also be increased to make up for the loss of external demand. Now, we know that stimulation of demand will indeed work because we have used such policy measures in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and Singapore weathered that crisis better, no thank you sir, than all the other Asian countries. So we believe that the best way to help the economy get back on its feet is through using both the bailout and fiscal policy measures because both are insufficient without the other. No thank you sir. Now, this concept is clearly alien to the free market economists, who give the argument of a moral hazard. Now, first of all, we've already told you that given the conditions that we've set, there's a high propensity that the moral hazard will not happen. Furthermore, it's not as if the banks themselves have not been burnt by the crisis. It's not as if they are not going to learn from their mistakes. But also, whether or not moral hazard occurs is the fact that we don't have a choice. The argument of moral hazard is not enough to justify us not bailing out banks. No, thank you, sir. Because Singapore cannot afford to let our banks fail. Now, we must get that in mind because recall the Great Depression in the 1930s. The reason why it spiraled downwards and led to such a Great Depression was because the banks were not saved. Over 300 banks were allowed to fail. No, thank you, sir. Singapore cannot afford to have that kind of situation in our economy. Secondly, they give the argument of wanting to punish the bank for the bad decisions it has made while saving the people through targeted assistance schemes. But this isn't fair for two reasons. Hold on a minute, sir. First of all, because the banks being bad is a moralistic argument that doesn't take into account the realities of the real economy. Yes, sir.
We do not mean to punish these banks for failing. It is only necessary for these inefficient banks to fail so that other efficient banks can take over.
I understand that because these banks have made mistakes, in your view, it's not necessary to bail them out. However, this is a moralistic argument because it doesn't take into account the reality of what a bank serves in our economy today. Now, banks are the lifeblood of the economy. Banks cannot be allowed to fail. Secondly, they're not going to end up helping the people through their tax assistance schemes because when a bank fails, the government has to take on the role of a bank, and the government has to use taxpayers' money to fund all the operations. So clearly, the taxpayers are going to be further penalized and not helped by their policy. Now, the Ministry of Finance also seems just as befuddled. First of all, their policy is not going to revive the economy because the the sharing risks policy is only a measure to prevent banks from failing and not to counter the failure of banks. So clearly something more is needed to revive the economy in a case of a bank failure. Secondly, Protecting banks is not just about guaranteeing deposits for consumers. Rather, it's about making sure that liquidity flows in the market. So their policy is clearly not enough. And their arguments on how banks won't fail at the same time also don't stand because of two words, Lehman Brothers. Lehman fell and it led to a whole string of other banks failing in the economy. Singapore banks are also linked because they are linked to the Singapore interbank offer rates. So when one bank is failing or not performing well, the other banks are also going to be affected. Banks are going to fail at the same time. So at the end of the day, in the final analysis, both the bailout and fiscal policy measures are necessary. In order to protect our economy, in order to protect our stability, we can and we must do both. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaslyn. The speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 26 seconds. I now call Jaslyn Wang of Innova Junior College to conclude the case and summarize for the proposition.
Now, I think the main issue put forth in today's debate is whether the government should insert itself into the financial market in the bailout fashion we see today. And at this side of the House, we would like to propose that a bailout is the exact wrong thing to be doing for improving the economy. And here's why. As mentioned by the speakers, the bailout sets a terrible precedent. If banks take huge risks and becomes too big to fail, the government will bail them out. The government will pick up the losses. Banks will then be encouraged. Banks will then be encouraged to take on more risk and not less. And this is essentially promoting moral hazard. Now we have to understand that banks go bankrupt because of the bad investment decisions that they make that exceed their capacity for risk. Allowing bad decisions to fail is essential to the proper functioning of the free market system. No. By propping up the should-be failures, we are preserving their inefficiencies and setting ourselves up for even grander and more devastating failure further down the road. Now, we have heard claims from the opposition side of the House that a bailout is necessary, all in the name of stabilizing financial system and in rebuilding investor confidence. Really? We don't think so. Bailouts are intended to restore confidence on the financial system, but only on the most superficial level. When our government assumes private debts to restore confidence in the private sector businesses, the debt burden is shifted to the public, and all it would do is to provide a short-lived burst of confidence. Then as market participants think through its operations and ramifications, the anxiety and stress conditions will return. And let me ask you then, how long is this forced euphoria going to last? We preserve investor confidence in a poorly managed bank that deserves to fail. The argument that this is the lesser of the two evils is a short-sighted one that continues our tradition of piling today's problems on the future. Borrowing from the future to pay today's bad debts only creates a temporary illusion of prosperity. In a few days, we then put another Band-Aid on top of the crisis to make everyone feel better, but fix nothing, pretending to have a free market system. But stepping in to prevent the necessary market corrections is an economic system based on politics and not economics. Then they say that bailouts are intended to stabilize the financial system. Yet, bailouts does nothing to change, to re-regulate the financial system so that the financial crisis doesn't happen again. Imperfect corporate governance, lack of transparency, regulatory failures still prevail. And we are, in fact, just pushing the problems into the future. Now, in our capacity as proponents of targeted assistance packages, we would like to propose that this is a far more superior measure than bailout policy tools. Now, by bailing out banks, we are essentially just throwing good money into the chests of investment banks with potentially rotten liabilities. And here we are taking the taxpayers' money who earned it to reward the most undeserving, those whose greed and stupidity caused this crisis. And therefore, we say that this is a horrendously bad decision to make. And it does little to minimize the adverse impact on the economically disadvantaged sectors of society. Worse, the existence of this program will block any other course of action being taken. It is so large, so resource-intensive an approach. So resource-intensive an approach that it preludes other remedies. Sure.
What can the free market do when banks fail, businesses fail, and a lot of Singaporeans go out of jobs on a massive scale never seen before in the history of Singapore? Deal with this.
Sorry, would you like to repeat your question again?
In the event that a bank fails, businesses will fail, and people will go out of jobs. What can the free market do about all these people who go out of jobs?
Now, we do acknowledge that there can be cascading effects when these big banks fail because all the businesses, individuals interconnected to these banks will definitely suffer. And therefore, here we are proposing a targeted assistance packages to assist those who are in need and just let the banks fear, let the banks go bankrupt and not do anything to help these banks. Instead, we're offering a targeted approach over here. So we should just let the price mechanism work on the mortgages and other financial instruments. Now, one analogy here is that buying up worthless assets is like trying to drink the ocean to stop a flood. And you can't do that, can you? So therefore, we should just let banks take the hit, let banks build the fire lines to contain the contagion.
Thank you, Jesslyn. The speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 14 seconds. I now call Deborah Ho of Victoria Junior College to conclude the case and summarize for the opposition.
The reason for this financial crisis is the crisis of confidence. The reason why there's a recession is because businesses are failing. Why is this so? It's because banks aren't willing to lend them money because they're afraid of two things. Firstly, there will be credit default. That other banks will refuse to lend them loans and then they will have less of cover the operating costs. They're also afraid of businesses defaulting on loans. So we see that in this case, the problem with today's economy is that there's a lack of confidence because there's weak economic sentiment. The only thing that we need to fear in today's crisis is fear itself. And so we see there are two ways, thank you, sir. There are two ways in which we can stimulate the economy and remove this weak economic sentiment. The first thing that we need to do is to inject liquidity back into the market. We need to make the banks willing to lend again. The second thing that we need to do is to make sure that consumers want to lend from banks and that they're willing to make loans in order that businesses can continue to flow, in order that credit in the market can continue to flow. So using these two criteria, let's see if any of the policies suggested today meet these two criteria in making sure that the economy goes back to its normal state of being. Now first, let's look at the Ministry of Finance's policy. They suggest letting banks fail. They suggest leaving it to the free market economy and making sure that the government takes over repaying deposits and repaying loans. However, we see that this is unfeasible on many grounds. Jamie has already told you about how banks in Singapore account for 66%, how the loans made by banks account for 66% of Singapore's GDP. If they want to include the additional problem of having to pay over for all the deposits of the banks that consumers have lost, what we say, this is a massive strain on Singapore's annual GDP. This is a massive drain on Singapore's reserves. If they are so concerned about taxpayers' money being used for the right reasons, then how can they suggest that the Singapore government become a private bank in itself and start lending out money to consumers and start lending out money to businesses? We say that this is simply unfeasible. Moreover, the job of the Singapore government is not to act as a private bank, but rather to regulate monetary policy. We said in this case, treating government as a private bank oversteps the boundaries of what government should do and does not bring economic sentiment at all. Thank you, sir. And we also say that they give up the suggestion that Singaporeans can simply move from the failing national banks to other foreign banks based in Singapore. However, we see that Singapore does not have so many banks. It is simple for consumers to move from local banks and straight to foreign banks. No, thank you, sir. And we say that even so, if there is such an option, Singaporeans will not be willing to do so. If the government is even willing to let the three major local banks fail in Singapore, what more confidence would they have in the remaining banks in Singapore? Especially so because they are foreign banks, we say that there is no guarantee then that the government will step in to help them should the foreign bank themselves fail. Jamie also told you about how the problems in Singapore mainly stem from the international economy. We said that there's no more confidence left in Singapore if the Singapore government would even let the Singapore banks fail, and because foreign banks themselves are not reliable enough to be counted on that they will not fail. Yes, madam.
Now, you say that bailing out banks will restore confidence in the financial market system. But here we are telling you that bailing out banks is a knee-jerk response given by the government. And here we say that targeted assistance approach is far more superior to restore confidence.
Now, this leads me nicely on to the next question. The next question then is, of course, whether the other policy of targeted assistance programs really works.
Now let's look at first at their whole policy. Firstly, their policy is unspecific because they never did give us a clear indication of what kind of assistance programs they want. Sarah, my first speaker, all told you about how we propose tax, no thank you ma'am, how we propose tax rebates, about how we propose, oh no thank you sir, about how we propose rental rebates. However, this did not come up in the proposition suggestion at all. Now, then of targeted assistance programs, I've already explained to you how in the economy it is not just necessary for banks to continue loaning, but it's also necessary for consumers to want to borrow money. Their policy apparently works to stimulate the demand in the economy. However, we say that even if consumer demand is high, banks must be willing to lend money in order for credit to flow. If a bank refuses to give loans, no thank you sir, if they refuse to give loans because they are afraid of payment defaults, what we say is that businesses will still fail because banks will not be willing to give them this credit and businesses will not get this credit. So what we need to do is to attack two sides of the problem. Firstly, to make sure that banks want to lend out money. Secondly, to make sure that consumers want to borrow this money. And we see that our policy guarantees that, because firstly, we're going to bail out the banks to inject liquidity, and secondly, we're going to have fiscal policy measures to make sure that consumers want have a greater demand. And so we say that their policies fail on both grounds because they do not solve any of the problems in this economy. And then the whole idea of free market principles, well, that's a textbook economics. So thank you, sir. Those are textbook economics. Free market principles only exist under certain assumptions that firstly, there's perfect competition and there's perfect information. But clearly we see that in the real world, this does not happen. And letting the banks to free market will not work at all because the fact that the free market principles of deregulation is precisely what brought us into this mess today. So we see the proposition's policy completely fails on both grounds that it does not fulfill the policy. And in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, what is needed is to stimulate both demand and as well as to stimulate liquidity. And in this case, our position is much better than even opposition first, because we are not just concerned with the bankers from Shenton Way, but we're also concerned with the people in the street. We are concerned about consumers and we want it for demand. So ladies and gentlemen, go with us because we represent both Wall Street and Main Street. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. The speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Thank you, speakers and judges. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the pre-university division finals. I now hand you back to your MC, Sarah Ann.
Thank you, Hui Hui. And our judges are now going to proceed backstage to deliberate the decision. A round of applause for our panelists, people.